Hi, it's Steph Mischuk. In this video, I'm going to talk about why OO, object-oriented inheritance, sucks. So, I don't know about any other type of inheritance. I guess personal inheritance. In terms of object-oriented programming, one of the fundamental structures of object-oriented programming is something called inheritance. So I assume for this particular video, you've done a little bit of object-oriented coding. You're learning it. You're a junior. So let me give you a piece of advice. Object-oriented inheritance sucks. Don't use it. It's something you should rarely, if ever, use. And the reason you don't want to use it because object-oriented inheritance will make your code base far more brittle. It will make it far more easy for you to break it. So let me just give you a quick story. So we're going to go way back in the 1990s when I was doing a lot of Java coding. So I was called in as a hired gun for a project for a publicly traded telco up here in Canada, cell phone company. And so I was on this team of coders, and we needed to get this project out for some deadline so that they could get their license to actually become a cell phone provider. So it was a top priority project. So I was one of a team of maybe 10 guys, 10 nerds, maybe 8. It's been a long time. So I was just brought in to do the help file system. That's it. My role was very limited in that regard. Nonetheless, so I was writing the code for that, and so we had a couple other guys. We had two lead coders. They're key to this particular story. So one lead coder, we'll call him Mick, and he was built the base classes for the entire system. He built out, well, not the entire system, but much of the system. So the base classes are like the foundation of the house. They're the first layer of objects. If you don't know OO coding, class is an object is a class, essentially. Anyway, so he built the base, we'll call them objects for the sake of the story. So he built the base objects. And back in those days, it was still early on in the OO in the commercial application, although OO, object-oriented coding, has been around for a while. A lot of people still design apps using inheritance, which is bad news. But we didn't know that. So you got this guy, Mick. He designs all the base classes, the base objects, and then he builds the next layer, the second layer on top, using inheritance. Basically, inheritance allows you to use code from your base classes into your subclasses so that you can, in theory, reuse the code and reuse the functionality of the base classes. Now, it sounds good in theory, but the problem is you're creating a very tight relationship, tight coupling, as they call it, between your base class and your subclasses, as they would call them, or the classes that are based on top of it. So what happens is that they become very brittle, because if anything changes with this underlying class, it will break your top level classes, your subclasses. So what happened, Mick was writing a bunch of code. He writes the base class, and he's writing, now at this point in the story, he's writing his subclasses. And he's writing, and he's right near me. He's like right over here. It's kind of an open concept office. And he's writing, he starts swearing, what's going on? Why isn't this working? Why isn't this working? And this is going on for like 2 hours, right? He's really getting frustrated because he can't figure out why one of his subclasses is not working. He doesn't know. So what he does, he goes back to the original base classes that he had built. And he goes in there, and what he discovers, somebody had changed the base class without telling him. So the other co-lead, Mick was one co-lead, and this guy John was the other co-lead. So Mick goes, John! And we're all listening. He goes, John, did you change the base class? Blah, blah, blah. I forget the name. He goes, yeah, I had to change it. So John goes, yeah, I had to change it because this, that, and this, and the other reasons. But he didn't tell Mick, so Mick just goes nuts. He goes, what the hell, why'd you do it? It cost me hours of work. Anyway, long story short, because John changed the base class and because Mick was using inheritance to try to use some of the code in the base class, he made his subclasses extremely brittle because John could change a variable name, could change the signature of a method. And all of a sudden, all your subclasses are screwed if they're based, they're done. So you don't want to use inheritance 99% of the time when you're building your apps. Inheritance was an idea that was interesting. It's kind of a passé idea. You may use it for sort of low-level infrastructure code once in a while, but I've never used inheritance. I never liked it because I always found it to be brittle. Instead, what you do is you design through interfaces, something called an interface. And I've talked about this in other videos. And the whole advantage of designing by an interface, just a little snapshot of this in a nutshell, is that the interface is not tightly bound to some base object. So you don't have that brittleness that you have when you use inheritance. So yeah, inheritance sucks. Don't use it. Designed by interfaces. And as always, keep your code clean. Keep your code simple. I would rather have simpler code that's 10-20% less efficient in some way or another than to have very complex code that's 10-20% more efficient. What do I mean by more efficient? Well, maybe you can write some very sophisticated code that will cut down the amount of code you're writing by 30% or 20%, but it's very complex, hard to understand. I wouldn't do that. I would rather simpler code that's a little bit more verbose, a little bit longer than very complex code. And same thing in terms of maybe runtime. Maybe you can write much more sophisticated code that's 10% faster, 20% faster. Now, unless it's really mission critical speed, because I still wouldn't do it. I wouldn't, because a lot of times 10%, 20% faster looks good on paper, but in reality, you don't really see much of a difference when you're using the app, right? It's kind of like when they talk about the specs on computers. You can spend, you get your mid-level computer, it'll cost you whatever, $1,000, but if you want to get like the top of the line chip, it will cost you much more, but you're only getting maybe a 15% faster computer. I never buy that ultra expensive computer that's 15% faster. Maybe if I was doing some heavy duty 3D animation, maybe, but generally speaking, it's not worth it. So when it comes to your code, simple is better, and object-oriented inheritance is a big thumbs down. That's it for now.